So if my math is correct, we are now 35 days from Christmas. And as soon as I say that, some of you like tense up, you're thinking about all the stuff you have to get done. But what that means is that some of you are already deeply engaged in the process of trying to find the perfect gifts for the people that you love. So if that's you, I've got a gift recommendation for you. I don't do this often, but this is something that I've really grown to love. At least it's entertaining. It'll fit almost anybody. So I've got a picture of it. It's an older book that's titled The Worst Case Scenario Survival Handbook. And in the book, these two survivalists go through, and they take 20 or 30 different situations, and in each of those situations, they break down step by step how you would survive if that were to happen to you. So if you read through the book, you'll find chapters titled How to Land a Plane, How to Survive a Train Derailment, How to Survive Being Buried Alive, How to Win a Sword Fight, How to Navigate Without GPS, How to Survive Dropping Your Cell Phone in the Toilet, which some of you may actually have experience with, it sounds like, but we won't talk about that. Then in chapter 7, they tackle topics like how to escape from quicksand, how to survive an earthquake, how to survive being lost in the mountains, how to survive an avalanche, and then my favorite is how to survive if your parachute does not open, which is a really short chapter if you look it up in the book. Another one of the scenarios that they deal with is titled How to Survive Adrift at Sea. And they advise a lot of common sense things like, stay in your boat, remain calm, don't drink the seawater, use your paddles to try and get to land, and finally talk about how to use the reflection off your watch, or if you have a pair of glasses, to signal other boats or maybe a plane that's flying overhead. And then the other thing they talk about in that chapter, which would be a good idea if you actually did it. They say that every time you get on a boat, you should carry with you a bag that includes the following: a waterproof radio, a change of clothes, canned food, a handheld GPS, drinking water in portable jugs, a compass, a flashlight, extra batteries, handheld flares, and a handheld water maker, whatever that is. Now, the first time I read that a few years ago, I remember thinking, to me, that sounds like the best case scenario. Like if I got on a boat and we got lost somewhere and I had all that stuff with me, then I could probably stay alive for at least a few days, and you probably could too. But if you wanted to make it a truly, worst case scenario, you'd have to say this: what do you do when you're adrift at sea and it feels like your boat is sinking? You have no life jacket, no lifeboat, no GPS, no handheld flares. There's nobody to call. There's no radio, and even if you had one, there's nobody out there. What do you do then? How do you survive that? That would be like the true worst case scenario. Now, if you have your Bible or your phone, I want you to turn to John chapter 6. Today, we're in week 5 of this series, which we're going through, and we're looking at 7 individual stories that the Apostle John highlighted in the Gospel of John about miracles that Jesus performed. But rather than calling them miracles, John is careful to call them signs. And that may seem like it's not an important distinction, but it is, because according to the dictionary at least, a sign is an object whose presence or occurrence indicates the probable presence or occurrence of something else. So a sign in and of itself is never the main thing. It always points you to something else, and in most cases points you to something better. So another way to think about it is that the purpose of a sign is to advertise something, to promote something, to identify something, or to give direction to someone. So what John is doing as we go through these stories is he's not just telling us these cool stories about these random acts of kindness that Jesus performed. Instead, he's trying to tell us something about Jesus. And when you get to the end of the gospel, John chapter 20, he summarizes his approach like this. He said, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. So these aren't the only things he did. It's just 7 that John wanted us to know about. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So again, John's purpose in these stories is not so that we would be impressed by the miracles as much as it is that we would come to a place where we start to believe in Jesus, and that by believing in Jesus, we would experience what he calls life, or what you might call eternal life. So if you were here last weekend, we looked at the first part of John chapter 6. There's this famous story about how Jesus takes 5 small loaves and 2 small fish, and he feeds this enormous crowd of not just 5,000 people, but most likely 5,000 families. And then at the end of that, you get to verse 14, and John tells us that after the meal was over, the people were so excited and by what they had just experienced with Jesus that they were ready to make him king. Here's the way John says it in John 6, verse 14. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. So the people in that crowd that day, as we talked about last week, were waiting for this political ruler who would show up on the scene, gather an army, march on Jerusalem, expel the Romans, and restore Israel's independence. But Jesus knew that his mission was a lot bigger and went a lot deeper than who was in office and who had the biggest army. So he separates himself from the crowd, and he goes up on a mountain to pray by himself. Now, as John chapter 6 continues, John briefly tells us what happened next. And if you had to pick a sign that represent this story, immediately what happened after the feeding of the 5,000, it would look something like this next sign. The way John tells the story, later that same day, so try to keep that in your mind as we go through this. So in the early part of the day, the afternoon, Jesus feeds this enormous crowd, and then later that same day, as the afternoon transitions into evening, Jesus tells his disciples to go back in the boat that they had originally come over in, and he says, "I want you to sail back across the Sea of Galilee from where they were in Bethsaida to Capernaum," which was kind of the home base for most of the disciples, and it's only about a 6-mile journey across the lake by boat. So they all gather in the boat, but the problem is that when they get there and when it's time for them to leave, they start to look around, and Jesus is nowhere with them. So Jesus had told them to go, but then when they go, he's not there with them. So you can sort of imagine they're all standing there looking at each other, trying to figure out, have you seen him? No. Did you see him? No. Did he say anything to you? No. Nobody knows where he is. Had to have been a pretty confusing moment. I mean, here they are. They're coming off of, just a few minutes before, one of the top 2 or 3 highlight moments of their entire life when they saw Jesus feed this enormous crowd. And now all of a sudden, they don't know where he is, and maybe worst of all, they don't even know if he's coming. And so they're unsure what they're supposed to do next. Finally, they get tired of waiting, they get in the boat, and they head off back across the Sea of Galilee. And then almost unbelievably, during their journey across the lake, things go from bad to worse. And if you look at the way John describes this, as we read these words, I want you to remember, it's really important to remember that John was there. He was an eyewitness to all of the things that he's getting ready to talk about. So if you have your Bible or your phone, I want you to look at how John describes this in verse 16 of John 6. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. Have you ever noticed, when something really good happens, it's usually not long until there's some unexpected challenge that pops up? I don't know how to explain it, but it's almost as if life itself has a way of kind of balancing out. And you know how it works. So maybe you get an unexpected bonus at your job, and then 3 days later, a technician tells you that your entire HVAC system has to be replaced at your house. Or maybe you finally find the car you've been waiting on, and you go to the dealership and you get it, and on the way home, the transmission goes out. Or maybe you get a note from your kid's teacher that says, hey, just want you to know your kid made the honor roll, and then you get home and there's a voicemail from the principal telling you your other kid is, in trouble. It's amazing how it works. But something really good happens, and then oftentimes it's followed by something that you never saw coming. And that's what happened to the disciples. It's incredible when you think about it. Literally, a few hours before this, they have one of these highlight moments, something they're going to talk about for the rest of their lives. And now just a few hours later, they find themselves in a real life worst case scenario because of an unexpected challenge, an unexpected storm. Some of you have been there. An unexpected job loss, a breakup, a scary diagnosis, the death of someone you love, legal trouble, financial trouble, relationship problems, and there are hundreds of ways it can happen, but the question I want us to think about today is, how do you survive that? How do you survive an unexpected storm? And as you look at this one little brief paragraph, it almost seems like it's just sort of inserted so that you can, understand the change in location as you try to follow along with John's narrative, but actually it's more than that, because what you see in one little paragraph in John 6 is a story of survival. So what I want to do is just walk through the story briefly, and then at the end I want to give you two things that'll help you survive any storm. But before we get there, I want to talk to you really quickly about the stages of a storm. See, one thing you see illustrated perfectly in this passage that all of us have experienced, sometimes we just don't know what to call it, are the stages of a storm. Whenever you're blindsided by some unexpected challenge, there almost always are these predictable stages that you go through. So if you're keeping track, here's the first one. Whenever you find yourself in a storm, you almost always find yourself dealing with a certain level of uncertainty. Almost always. I've got another picture I want to show you. If you were to travel to the Sea of Galilee today, that's it. You would see that it sits very much below sea level. It's 686 feet below sea level. It's surrounded by mountains on three sides. And so what that means is when the sun begins to set, meteorologists say that the cooler air from the west will rush into the valley. It'll combine with the other, and it'll cause these violent storms to erupt. That's a reality that still continues to this day. I was reading just this week, May 14th of this year, they had a huge storm that blew across the Sea of Galilee. The wind measured 90 miles an hour. There were waves of over 10 feet, according to news reports. It blew down trees. It destroyed homes. It blocked roads. It also destroyed the popular Tiberias Boardwalk, a place that have all sorts of these shops and restaurants. The damage was estimated to be $50 million just from this one storm. One restaurant owner described it to the newspaper. She said, it looked like a scene from a horror movie. Everything was destroyed in a matter of hours. And that was just a few months ago. But that's the kind of thing that's been happening there for a really long time. That's just part of life when you live next to the Sea of Galilee. But as you look at this story, the storm was only part of the disciples' problem. In fact, it wasn't even the biggest problem. The bigger problem was that they didn't know where Jesus was. And remember, just a few hours earlier, they stood back, they watched in amazement. He takes this little kid's lunch, and he prays over, and he multiplies, and he feeds thousands of people. And now it says the nighttime has come, the evening has come, and the water's growing rough, and nobody knows where Jesus is. I love the way John says at the end of verse 17. He says, by now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. You ever felt like that? As David said, you ever felt like the conditions were deteriorating and you didn't know where Jesus was? Keep in mind that these guys had not done anything wrong. They were exactly where Jesus told them to go, doing exactly what Jesus told them to do, and yet they get caught in an unexpected storm. Now here's the second stage. It's when it moves from uncertainty to anxiety. One of the things I love about this story is that because John was both a storm survivor and a masterful writer, as I hope you've seen as we worked our way through these stories, as you read through his account of what happened, he uses certain phrases that are meant on the surface to capture and record the events of that night while also communicating the emotions of that night. So as you read through, you'll see these phrases like where he says, by now it was dark. And yeah, he's saying it was dark, but he's saying more than that. A strong wind was blowing, and you can almost feel the wind. The waters grew rough. And you know what he's saying. You can feel the emotion. You can almost feel your anxiety growing along with his as he describes what they went through that night. You ever notice that as you go through life, there are certain phrases that as soon as you hear them, they cause your pulse to quicken and your anxiety to rise? You know what they are. You pick up the phone and somebody says, I'm sorry, but there's been an accident. And you can just feel it. Hey, we need to talk. Or your boss calls you in, and as soon as the door closes, they say, I'm sorry, but we're letting you go. You can just feel it. You go to the doctor and they say, hey, we saw something that we're not sure what it is, and we're going to send you for further testing. It's amazing how it works, but there are these phrases that you hear, and they promote all this uncertainty, and then as the uncertainty settles in, it turns into anxiety, and that's where the disciples were that night. The longer it went on, the more anxious they became. The third stage of a storm is what I call the frustration stage. You get to verse 19, and John includes one of those eyewitness details that's easy to skip over if you're not careful. Here's what he said. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. Now most of the time, you read that verse, if you're like me, you get hung up on the second part of that verse, right? Where it says they saw Jesus, he's approaching them, and he's walking on the water. And you read that and you think, what? Like that doesn't register, right? Like you've never walked on water, you've never seen anybody walk on water, so it's only natural that you would obsess over the second part of that verse. But before you get to the second part of that verse, make sure you catch the first part of that verse where John says when they had rowed for 3 or 4 miles. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this particular story is that it's told in 3 of the 4 Gospels. So you put all that together, you get to see this story from 3 different angles. And in Mark's telling of the story, he includes a particular detail that John chose to leave out of his telling of the story. It reads like this in Mark chapter 6, verse 47. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land, talking about Jesus. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Now check out this. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass them by. Now, as best we can tell, the older translations say it was the 4th watch of the night, which means it was somewhere between 4 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the morning when Jesus finally showed up. And here's why this matters. You go back to verse 16 of John chapter 6, and John tells us that it was early evening when the disciples got in the boat. That means it was somewhere between, let's say, 8 and 9 o'clock. So they get in this boat. It's early evening. The sun has just gone down. Afternoon is transitioned. The darkness has arrived. And it's a 6-mile journey across the Sea of Galilee. So you've got all these guys, most of whom are professional fishermen. So this is a life that they're used to. This is the kind of travel they're used to. And at best, it would take about 45 minutes for some professionals, maybe an hour if they weren't really hustling, for them to get from point A to to point B. It's going to be kind of a straight shot across the sea, and everybody will go home that night and sleep in their own bed. But because of the storm, what they thought was going to be sort of an easy journey turned into an all-night struggle. Can you imagine how frustrating that would be? Can you imagine how exhausted they must have been? You spend 7 or 8 hours straining at the oars just trying to keep that thing from blowing away. Now, some of you know what that's like because there's something that you've been straining against for a really long time. Maybe as you look back over your life, there is a sense of frustration that is set in because it doesn't feel like you've made much progress. You thought the path from point A to point B was going to be pretty straight and smooth, and you got involved in the process, and it's been anything but. Some of you are sitting here right now, and if you allowed yourself, you could feel the weight of that frustration bearing down on you. And one of the things I'm certain probably added to their growing frustration was the fact that according to Mark at least, just a few months earlier, they had been in a very similar situation. Mark tells the story. They're out on the Sea of Galilee. The storm erupts. Only this time, Jesus was in the boat with them. And so Jesus stands up and he tells the storm to be still. And the storm dissipates and everybody moves on and lives happily ever after. But now, a few months later, they find themselves in almost the exact same situation. The only difference is, this time, Jesus is nowhere to be found. And that leads to the fourth stage of the storm, and that's fear. It starts with uncertainty. Pretty soon that uncertainty gives way to anxiety. If that goes on long enough, it turns to frustration. And eventually, if it's not dealt with, that frustration can turn to fear. The fear of the future, the fear of not making it, the fear of what might happen next, the fear of not measuring up. I mean, we've all been there at one time or other. Some of us have lived our lives there. I mean, there are some of us, if we were to go back and, write a biography of our lives, the chapter titles would be uncertainty, anxiety, frustration, and fear. Some of you feel it, even as you're in this room. You can feel the sky growing dark, the wind picking up. And if you listen close enough, you can hear the waves starting to crash. So what are you supposed to do? How do you survive a storm? As you look at this passage, there are two key things to surviving any storm, no matter when they hit or how intense they are. Here's the first one. If you want to survive the storm, you have to invite Jesus in. You have to invite him into your storm. You have to take him in your boat. One of the things I love about this story, and I keep coming back to this as we work our way through these signs, is that each of them, even though the details differ from story to story, each of them follows pretty much the same storyline. I call it the signs storyline. So it always starts, you've got some unsolvable problem, you've got some impossible situation, and nobody knows what to do. And the second stage of that is that Jesus somehow gets involved in that situation. Sometimes he invites himself, other times he's invited in. And then once he gets involved, he always asks the people involved to do something, to take some step, to believe something, to do something that on the surface of it makes zero sense for them to do. So if you've been tracking with us over the last few weeks, he tells the servants at the wedding reception to fill those water jugs with water when what they really need is wine. Then you get to that royal official. He says, I want you to go on about your business because your son is going to live, even though there was no evidence to indicate that any of that was true. He goes to the paralyzed man. He says, hey, I want you to take up your mat and walk. And you read the story, you're like, well, if he could do that, he wouldn't need to be healed. But Jesus tells him to do it anyway. Then last week, he takes the 5 loaves and 2 fish. He says, I want everybody to sit down, and we're going to take this little meal, and we're going to pray over it, and we're going to start passing it out. And you think, what is he doing? And then somehow he makes it work. But here's the thing I want you to notice. As you go through the storyline, in each and every instance, there's a part of this that you don't have any control over. And that's the first part, the unsolvable problem. Another way to say it is that the storms come, ready or not. I mean, the storms of life are inevitable. They always come. But what you do have some measure of control over is the second part, and that's when Jesus gets involved, because you have the ability to invite him to get involved. You have the ability to ask him to get involved in whatever your situation might be. So one of the things I love about this story is that the whole time the storm is raging, what are they doing? They're looking for Jesus. They're waiting for him. And so finally he shows up, and it says they immediately take him in the boat. They don't allow their frustration or their fear to paralyze them. They don't keep straining, trying to do it themselves. They simply invite Jesus to get in the boat with them, because they know that if Jesus gets in the boat with them, then eventually everything will be okay. But first, you have to take him in. So if you want to survive the storm, first, you have to invite Jesus in. And then secondly, you have to trust Jesus' promise. See, one of the things that John drives home in this story is that when they first saw Jesus walking toward them on the surface of this water, they were terrified. And you would have been too, right? I mean, if you're used, this is a pro tip here, if you're used to seeing people walk on water, you've got some other issues that we need to talk about. I mean, this is not the kind of thing that you just see that, so, oh yeah, here comes Jesus. I mean, it says they were scared to death. And then you get to verse 20. And after a long and frustrating night of silence, Jesus shows up. And not only does he show up, he finally speaks. Check this out in verse 20 of John chapter 6. But he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. Now the phrase that I want you to key in on in verse 20 is where it says, "It is I, don't be afraid." Now keep in mind, as Jesus spoke those words, they still had a lot of reasons to be afraid. I mean, the storm was still swirling, the sky was still dark, the wind was still blowing, the waves were still crashing, everything around them was raging, and at that moment the future was still very much uncertain, but Jesus tells them to take their eyes off the storm and to put their eyes on him. And so he speaks a word, but it's not just any word. I mean, it's a kind of word that as soon as they heard it, they would have known what he was saying, and they would have connected the dots. And remember, as we go through these, John doesn't say these are miracles. He says they are signs, because they're meant to teach us something about Jesus. And this story is the perfect example, because as soon as Jesus said, "It is I," in their minds, the disciples would have immediately heard the echoes of God the Father from the Old Testament. Throughout the Old Testament, God the Father had a particular name that he went by, and the name was, "I am who I am." In Hebrew, it's one word, it's Yahweh. In Greek, it's this unusual construction that's pronounced ego eimi. And that's the phrase that John used. And as soon as they heard it, they would have known exactly what Jesus was saying. Rather than just being a mysterious kind of rabbi who travels around and says some provocative things, and occasionally, does a magic trick that gets everybody all stirred up. He was claiming to be God in the flesh. And as soon as he said that, they would have known that. And so here's the deal. When you have an all-powerful God who is with you in the storm, it doesn't matter how big the storm is or how intense the storm is, because the storm can't compare to God. So they invite Jesus into the boat. And then in verse 21, it says, immediately they reached the shore where they were heading. Now notice, if you've been paying attention, unlike the first story in Mark that Mark tells, John never says that Jesus stopped this storm. Never says that. All he says is that Jesus got in the boat and they somehow made it where they were going. And sometimes that's how it works. Sometimes he gets in the boat and he stands up and he tells the storm to dissipate and it's clear skies and smooth sailing. Other times he gets in the boat and he just sort of rides along with you as you try to navigate the storm, and eventually you get to where he wants you to be. I have another picture I want to show you. Just leave that up for a minute. Back during fall break, there was a group from here that traveled to eastern Kentucky where we saw firsthand the devastating effects of the flooding that took place over there. And if you haven't been there, it's really hard to wrap your mind around just the level of destruction just everywhere you look. When we arrived there on a Wednesday or a Tuesday night, I don't know, Tuesday, whatever day it was, they lined everybody up, and the people at this ministry center had a whole list of jobs at different places and different locations that they needed completed. So they lined everybody up, and they just go down the line. Of course, they want to know, like, what can you do, right? Like, what are your skills so they'll know where to see. So they go through, and you got one guy says, I'm a builder. Next guy says, I'm a plumber. Next guy says, I'm an electrician. Just, they go down the line, and they get down to the end of the line, and there's me and Austin. And they said, what can you guys do? And I said, honestly, not much. But if you need somebody to pray, I'm your guy. And if you got any announcements, Austin can handle that. Unfortunately, they already had that part figured out. So they sent us with, David was there, and H, and some other guys, and they sent us to Whitesburg to hang insulation. So if you need some insulation at your house, don't call us. Do not call us, because we're not coming. But when we got there, we get to Whitesburg, and we meet this guy, Larry Adams. Larry's an older guy. He just retired as the circuit court clerk in Letcher County. So we go, and when the flood hit, it just made everything was so devastated. When the flooding happened, not only was the bottom floor of his home destroyed, it destroyed 4 other homes on his property that were all occupied by family members. So they all sort of just live on this same, probably 3-acre lot. And you look out, and it's just everything is flooded, everything is ruined. And this storage barn that you see is setting probably 10, 15 yards off of Larry's back porch. Now, the thing was, before the flood, that thing was 100 yards away from his house. But the water came in and lifted it up and just kept, so it tells you, about the force of the water as it came rushing through that little valley. Now, here's the thing. You don't recognize it, but you've seen that before. And here's how I know. If you watched any of the news coverage of the flood, you've seen this particular barn before. Let me show you the next picture. That's the top of that same barn. Went viral, was on CNN, Fox News, USA Today, New York Times. Everybody had some copy of that picture. And the girl you see, and I wish we could zoom in, but the girl you see is 17-year-old Chloe Adams. She's Larry Adams' granddaughter. And in the little box there, she's got her dog, a dog named Sandy. So she's the granddaughter. And the way she tells the story, she lived in one of the houses that was across the field from her grandfather's house. So she wakes up on that Thursday morning to the sound of water rushing in her bedroom. And she gets up and she immediately makes her way to the back porch. And she said, as soon as I looked out, there was water as far as I could see. I mean, it's just raising like you wouldn't believe. So she goes to the back deck and she starts screaming for help. And her grandfather, who's on the second floor of his house, sticks his head out the window. He hears her and he tells her to go back in the kitchen and get on top of the kitchen table and wait for him. And he said he'll come get her. Unfortunately, though, the water just kept rising. And her grandfather couldn't get to her. So she said she made a decision at that point. She puts her dog in this little thing that floats, and she decides to swim to try to get to higher ground. She told CNN that the whole time she was swimming, she was thinking, I'm alone in this. If I'm going to survive, I'm going to have to do it. So she made it as far as she could. She lands on top of that storage building, which again is 12, 14 feet off the ground, behind her grandfather's house, but which by then is almost completely flooded. She spent a total of 5 hours on top of this barn, waiting for somebody, waiting for anybody to come and rescue her and her dog. Listen to the way she described it to the New York Times. She said, the hours of waiting were torture. First, there were hard rains beating down on us. Then the sun came out and nearly burned us alive. The whole time, the insects nearly ate us alive for 5 hours. And then, just when she's getting ready to give up hope, as the water continues to rise, she looks up around the corner at the head of the holler, and I could take you there. And coming around the corner is her grandpa in a kayak. And he somehow gets her, and they make it back to higher ground. Now, in many ways, the picture of Chloe Adams trapped on top of a building, waiting to be rescued, is a picture of all of us. I mean, there are some storms that no matter how hard you try, no matter how much you may want to, you can't survive on your own. It's hard to explain, but some of you have experienced it. There are some storms that are so intense and so powerful that the only hope of survival you have is if somebody besides you steps into your situation and rescues you. It's the same thing the disciples were dealing with in the boat on the Sea of Galilee. And so they did the only thing they could do, and she did the only thing she could do. She asked for help. Because sometimes that's all you can do. Now I want you to stand with us as we close today. I'm not going to pretend to know the storms that you're going through. Nobody may know what you're going through except for you. But whatever it is, I want to encourage you to do the one thing that you can always do. And sometimes it's the only thing you can do because there's nothing else you can do. And that's to invite Jesus into your situation. That's to invite him into your boat. So if you have questions about how to do that, if you'd like to pray with somebody, if you need help trying to figure out what your next step should be, you just meet us on this front row, and David and I would be glad to talk with you.